Cheers from Democrats after Congress passes the controversial Respect for Marriage Act.
In our judgment, it's a bad bill for us and other religious organizations and sort of for the cause of religious freedom generally.
The concerns religious groups are raising, an analysis from the Catholic perspective.
Speech is not a right that the government provides.
I have clients from all different walks of life. I have clients who identify as LGBT. And while I serve everyone, I cannot promote every message through my business.
Discrimination or freedom of speech, the Supreme Court case that's testing the scope of anti-discrimination laws.
I feel that I am able to perform my role, to walk with them, with God, in their plight as a seafarer.
And a rare glimpse inside the ministry providing safe harbor for souls at sea. A chisel, a mallet, and a love for Christ. We speak with the artists who create handmade creches for the Vatican and the world. EWTN News In Depth starts now.
The religious liberty protections in this bill, the Respect for Marriage Act, are insufficient. They don't address the real problems that arise for religious organizations.
There are plenty of protections in this. This doesn't require any house of worship or any faith group to marry people who, marry queer people.
Legislation federally codifying same-sex and interracial marriage passes in Congress, but some critics say it will heighten threats to religious liberty, and many in the LGBTQ community say it doesn't go far enough. The Respect for Marriage Act redefines marriage to include same-sex couples nationwide, while the Democratic caucus says the goal is to protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination. Faith leaders, including the Catholic Church, have decried the lack of protections for religious organizations and a loss of traditional values reflected in federal law. EWTN reporter Mark Irons explains.
The motion is adopted.
Now on its way for President Biden to sign into law a bill titled the Respect for Marriage Act. It's praised by Catholic Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, even though the bill rejects Catholic Church teaching on marriage.
A major victory for freedom, dignity, and equality for all.
The opposite view expressed a few miles from the U.S. Capitol at the Catholic University of America, where lawyer Ginny Bradley Lichter represents the historic school.
This university affirms the Catholic belief about marriage, which is that marriage is between one man and one woman.
That definition of marriage isn't anything new. Historically speaking, it's been the view of the Catholic Church for centuries and widely accepted within society at large. It's true that in the past 10 to 20 years in the U.S. and countries around the world, many laws about marriage have changed, providing rights to same-sex couples. But true definitions are hard to erase. Still, Catholic President Joe Biden will soon sign off on a new definition to enshrine in the U.S. Federal Code. He says the Respect for Marriage Act will help to ensure that Americans have the right to marry the person they love. To put it all in perspective, in 1996, Democratic President Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. It read in part, "The word marriage means only a legal union between one man and one woman as husband and wife." The Supreme Court would later deem this unconstitutional, but now the Defense of Marriage Act is officially repealed and a new definition added to the federal books, reading in part, "An individual shall be considered married if that individual's marriage is between two individuals." Democrats and a number of Republican supporters of the law believe it will also protect marriage rights for interracial couples and advance basic freedoms.
The freedom to love who you want to love, to marry who you want to marry.
Democratic Congressman Andy Levin told us it was important to pass a bill that would bolster the rights of same-sex couples. In its 2015 Obergefell versus Hodges decision, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex civil marriage across the country, ruling states cannot deny marriage licenses to gay couples. But this summer, after the conservative majority court ruled there is no explicit constitutional right to an abortion, Democrats feared the justices could roll back same-sex rights next. Pointing to conservative Justice Clarence Thomas, who said, "We should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Obergefell." With the Respect for Marriage Act in place, same-sex marriages would still be legally recognized even if the Supreme Court overturned its decision in Obergefell.
We put these rights in federal law so that there's no question about it, so that if the Supreme Court decides to take them away, we have them in federal statute.
The new law doesn't require houses of worship to host same-sex weddings, but concerns from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, as well as some members of Congress, include a lack of explicit religious liberty protections.
This legislation expressly empowers private litigants to sue religious institutions, faith-based organizations, and private parties who oppose, for sincerely held religious beliefs, same-sex marriage.
The USCCB says this bill fails to include clear, comprehensive, and affirmative conscience protections for religious organizations and individuals who uphold the sanctity of traditional marriage that are needed.
And although Catholic institutions won't be required to facilitate same-sex wedding ceremonies, there could still be consequences, including for Catholic schools.
The university affirms the dignity of every person, regardless of their sexual orientation, but that's really not what this bill is about.
Jenny Bradley Lichter says the Catholic University of America could be vulnerable to litigation.
And there could be impacts on our ability, for example, to decide how to shape our workforce, how to handle benefits, how to handle student housing, or a number of other issues that touch on and grow from our religious identity.
Lichter told us she also worries about faith-based adoption agencies that strive to place needy children in homes with a traditional mother and father. We asked Congressman Levin if those adoption agencies should be required to violate their deeply held religious beliefs and place children with same-sex couples.
I mean, I think that if you're going to get in the business of doing adoptions, you have to follow the federal law.
At the end of the day, the change in a federal law or legal definition or public opinion about marriage won't change the truth about marriage, something the church has passed on throughout the centuries. Mark Irons, EWTN News in Depth.
To give us his perspective on the legislation and clarify the Catholic Church's teaching on marriage, we're joined now by Father Thomas Petrie, the president of the Dominican House of Studies. Father, it's so great to have you here with us. Why is the Catholic Church in the U.S. so concerned with a federal right to same-sex marriage? Why does a change in federal statutes, even 7 years after the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, matter to us?
Well, because marriage is a natural institution of a man and a woman, and this is for the sake of raising children, producing and raising children that benefit not only the family, but also benefit society and ultimately for the glory of the church and the glory of God. This new bill, the so-called Respect for Marriage Act, makes it the law of the land that marriage is something that it's not. It attempts to make marriage simply whatever a couple, whether they be a man and a woman or two men and two women, whatever they want it to be. I mean, it's a slippery slope. Why limit it to two at this point? It just further confuses and now makes the law of the land something that is false and will eventually push and attempt to push, I believe, and I think a lot of the bishops believe, will eventually attempt to push religious groups such as the Catholic Church into having to not only tolerate this incorrect, false notion of marriage, but actually to sanction it and attempt to make us sanction that which is wrong and morally immoral.
Now, Father, religious institutions, they hold all kinds of things in tension, understanding that they live in a secular world that is different from our religious world, our world that serves to glorify God, and we do hope to transform through evangelization the rest of the world. How can you hold those two in tension, make political judgments about something, and at the same time reaffirm beliefs internally?
Well, I mean, there's always going to be prudential calculus on how to pass policies and how to push, virtue and holiness and the common good as the direction and goal of politics. But the thing is the eternal truths, the eternal, for instance, the intrinsic dignity of the human person. We can hold in balance the fact that every person should be loved and welcomed as a child of God, but at the same time dispute and, in fact, condemn behaviors that we know, not only by faith, but by reason, are in fact harmful to the dignity of the human person, harmful to the family, harmful to children.
And the Catholic Church does have a history of protecting minorities and fighting bigotry and injustice. How do you separate issues of sexual morality from the love for the individual person? Can you do that?
Well, this new Respect for Marriage Act draws a parallel between interracial marriage and homosexual marriage as if the two are equal. The Catholic Church has always defended the rights of minorities and those who are on the fringes. The difference between interracial marriage and homosexual marriage is precisely the difference of what marriage is intended to be and intended to do, which is to say to reproduce children and to raise children by a mother and a father who are invested in them and committed to their well-being. And gay couples of the same sex, are fundamentally biologically incapable of performing the duties and responsibilities that are inherent in the marital relationship for the sake of the children.
And for those viewers with family members that identify within the LGBTQ community or identify as same-sex attracted, what pastoral advice do you have for them in light of these changes in the law? These are things that can be very hard to hear and very hard to express.
Absolutely, they can be very difficult to hear. But those who are on the path of chastity, the path to Jesus Christ, understand the challenges. I mean, the challenges we all face, regardless of our weaknesses or regardless of what our dispositions are. We all have challenges and sins that we're sort of tempted to. So for those who are sort of caught in the middle between a culture that says everything is fine and the gospel of Jesus Christ, which demands a higher way and a narrow way, I can only say that the grace of God is given to us to actually fulfill what God calls for and to fulfill what he's created us to be. God is not hiding holiness and he's not hiding perfection from us. He's offering it, but we have to not resist. We cannot sort of go the cultural way and presume that that is God's way. And that goes for everything, whether it's sexual morality, whether it's, how we handle finances, how we handle immigration, everything. We have to, as Christians, follow the gospel path, and we are given the grace to do so, even when it's difficult.
And Father, we also then, you have this great background in philosophy and also in political theory, and you understand the law. Does the law always have to reflect the views of our faith? And what do we do when it doesn't?
Well, I mean, it's in a democracy such as ours, in a democratic republic such as ours, it's not always going to reflect our understanding of the common good and how the common good ought to be pursued. That's just sort of the nature of our society and our country. But when it doesn't, when we have a law such as this, as the so-called Respect for Marriage Act, which doesn't, in fact, respect marriage, what we can do and what we ought to do as Catholics and people of faith is to continue to live our life and to continue to live marriage properly and rightly and with holiness, with the grace of God that we're given in the sacrament of matrimony, to be living examples to the culture of what a true marriage ought to be, a marriage that is fulfilling, even at times a marriage that is difficult.
And we know that since Obergefell, the change in American opinion about marriage or the non-religious definition of marriage or civil unions has changed. 70% of Americans believe that same-sex marriage is okay, and that includes Catholics. As a church, what is the call to us? What is the call for you as a pastor, knowing that these are the circumstances that we're in?
Well, the problem, and I think you and I have talked about this before, the problem obviously has been just generations of poor catechesis on the part of priests and theologians and catechists and helping people to understand, including our Catholics, what marriage is. That's been combined with the fact that Catholics live in the same culture that we're discussing. And so Catholics themselves have not lived the beauty of marriage faithfully. The Catholic divorce rate is just as high as the divorce rate in the culture. And so Catholics haven't imbued and haven't been living the teaching of the faith on marriage and marital sexuality and marital life. And they haven't been given it for generations. I mean, there's just been a radical breakdown in catechesis. Now, thankfully, I think everyone from Pope John Paul II to Pope Francis and the American bishops to priests, be informed and that have been ordained over the last 20-25 years, recognize that. And so increasingly, thanks be to God, we're seeing more and more catechetical outreach and more resources to get the message out of what the church teaches about marriage, why marriage is beautiful, and why even in those challenging seasons that every married couple has, the grace of God is still living and effective.
Well, we're grateful for your clarity. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Montse.
To see our previous coverage and more discussions on the Respect for Marriage Act on EWTN News In Depth, visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Be sure to like and follow. Democrats take the lead in the Senate as the count for a contentious race completes. An expert panel discussion on the impact the makeup of Congress could have for the current and future administrations coming up after the break.
Love the ship visiting because I'm able to fulfill my role as a deacon to serve the seafarers in whatever capacity I can.
Chaplains share their stories of outreach to those spending months at sea with no spiritual guidance. Plus, concerns after the State Department neglects to include Nigeria on a religious freedom watch list, despite Christians suffering continual attacks. That story still to come.
It is my honor to utter the four most powerful words ever spoken in a democracy. The people have spoken.
I don't want any of you to stop believing in America. I want you to believe in America and continue to believe in the Constitution and believe in our elected officials most of all. Continue to pray for them.
The runoff election in Georgia is over. Senator Raphael Warnock is re-elected to a full 6-year term in the U.S. Senate. And with that, the 2022 midterm elections are finally complete. Though a few lingering votes are still being tabulated in California House races, the balance of power is now clear. America remains closely divided. Democrats will have the majority in the Senate, 51-49. Republicans will be in control of the House of Representatives. The final projection, Republicans with 222 seats and the Democrats with 213. Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. What are the implications of a closely divided Congress on issues important to religious communities? Will it be gridlock or can progress be made? We're joined by two returning commentators, each with deep insights into this subject. Kristen Day is the Executive Director of Democrats for Life of America, and J.D. Long Garcia is the Senior Editor of America Magazine. Thank you and welcome to you both. I'm sure you've watched this runoff season very closely and the push to get everything done before the shift in power happens in January. Kristen, the runoff in Georgia had specific religious dynamics with Senator Warnock's Souls to the Polls campaign and an embrace of pastors pushing to get out the vote. Was this just state specific, or do we think we'll see a resurgence of faith in elections and Democrats getting religion?
Oh, I sure hope so. I hope it's an increasing trend because we have seen a lot of attacks, on religious and religious freedom. So it is a hopeful trend. But the problem that I have with the Reverend's position on abortion, which is deeply concerning, and the fact that he voted for a bill that would basically allow abortion up till birth. So while the trend is good and moving toward more, supporting religion and promoting a religion is good, the abortion position is just so deeply concerning.
Well, we'll talk about abortion a little bit more in a second. JD, let's talk about race. Race was a factor as well, with Senator Warnock becoming the first black senator in Georgia and continuing that trend. These milestones are significant. What did they tell us? What do they represent?
Yeah, I think that the Congress is catching up in many ways to who we are as a nation. So I think that those things can be applauded. Herschel Walker obviously was another African-American candidate that was running. So in either case, there would have been I believe the first black senator elected to an entire senatorial term. That was going to happen inevitably. But I think as we're going through that, we also have to look at what the candidates stand for and look beyond their race as well.
Absolutely. And voter issues and redistricting cases have reached the Supreme Court involving race as well. How might this affect people of faith? JD, please let me know what you think. And Kristen, if you want to weigh in on that, I'd be interested in hearing what you think that means for the party as well.
Yeah, I think the redistricting that happens depends on what party's in power. It kind of changes. I think that we've seen, like in New York, we saw a lot of kind of surprise victories from from Republicans in certain sections there. In Texas, we saw a lot of Hispanic, Latino candidates that were running, and some won, some didn't. So I think that that's all a lot. We have to be careful about that. And again, I think that paying attention to where people stand on the issues is very important.
Kristen, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, redistricting always is a huge issue. We do it every 10 years, and I was involved several years ago when we redistricted in Michigan. And, it really does depend on who's in power and how the lines come out. But I think it's becoming less clear, especially with the Hispanic and Black vote changing and the Republicans increasing their ability to reach out to these two demographics. So we'll have to see how it will play out.
And an important issue now, let's talk about how that affects abortion as well. With abortion now at the state level, what might 2023 look like? It seemed to fare pretty poorly in the midterms.
It did appear to produce some very huge disappointments for us in some areas. But when you look at the overall effect, when you look at other states, such as Ohio, where Tim Ryan wasn't able to pull off a victory there, largely due to his position on abortion. So it was a net negative for Democrats there. In Michigan and other places where they had ballot initiatives, we were outspent. The pro-life side was outspent 10-1, and getting the message out that that wasn't the truth about what the ballot initiatives have done. So we do have a huge thing to do in 2023 is educating people on the real effect of some of these ballot initiatives and how they will harm women. We are working in Virginia to pass a 15-week limitation bill. And we see the challenge here is, yes, we want to do a 15-week limitation bill, but also we need a whole life package to support women and help her have the ability to bring that pregnancy to term.
JD, I'm going to ask you. Sorry, JD, I'm going to ask you about pregnancy support in a second. But before that, Kristen, do you think a 15-week abortion ban at the federal level might be possible?
I do not think next year. I think the battle should be in the states right now. So states like Virginia, who are looking at a 15-week limitation bill, and other states who are looking at, heartbeat bills or 8-week limitation bills. So I think the challenge, it really should be in the states right now. The Senate will definitely not pass a 15-week limitation. The House may, but it won't go anywhere. We wouldn't have the numbers to override the veto if it did end up getting to President Biden. So I think we really should focus on the states and looking at how we can lower the maternal mortality rate, how we can address, accommodations in the workplace for women, pregnant women, lowering the maternal mortality rate. I think we need to look at the whole picture of how we can best support pregnant women in making a real choice and not feeling like abortion is the only choice. And the states have the ability to really come up with innovative ways to do this.
Exactly along those same lines, JD, the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is endorsed by the USCCB but has some worrying it might pay for abortion travel, provides some reasonable accommodations for pregnant workers. It failed in the Senate yesterday but speaks to the post-Roe reality for women. What are your thoughts on the act?
Yeah, I think that and that we can't find any kind of compromise solutions here. But speaking related to what, or echoing what Kristen was saying, I think that that's true. I think that we're in a place right now in the Senate, and we will be in the House as well, where we're not able to find that kind of compromise legislation that actually represents what most Americans believe and what Americans hope for. So I think it's tragic that we're not going to be able to pass a 15-week ban in Congress in the coming session. And I think that this last act that just failed, I think, is an indication of what is in store for the coming 2 years.
And what else needs to be happening? Real quick, let's talk about another issue that also has great controversy associated with it, immigration and immigration reform. Might that be something that is possible or could it be brought to the table again in this new Congress?
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, one of the hopes that I had in 2008 when Obama won was that we were going to see some sort of immigration legislation that was passed. I mean, I know that we came really close to passing the DREAM Act back then, and that was when the presidency, the House, and the Senate were all controlled by Democrats. But it didn't seem to happen then. And I feel like in some issues that there is a lot of support from citizens that they do support something like the DREAM Act, and they maybe have more questions about a larger package. So I don't know that the Republicans are going to be willing to come along on that, where the Democrats may talk about being. But again, like I say, I mean, I feel like as a person that's very passionate about immigration myself, and I'm an immigrant, I don't feel like the Democratic Party has fallen short often when it comes to immigration reform.
Kristen, you had some comments on that as well.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that, I mean, there are bipartisan discussions going on right now, so I am hopeful that immigration is addressed. It's such an important issue for our nation and how we treat people coming into this country. So I am hopeful that they will be able to solve this issue. And I just want to say back to the pregnancy accommodation bill, it's not dead yet, so don't give up hope. We're working to try to see if we can come up with a compromise to get it passed. So we're working hard to see it done before the end of the year.
Well, women definitely need to have at least that small start be something that addresses all of the needs that they have to be able to keep their children. JD and Kristen, real quick, rumors of Biden re-election campaign after President Macron's visit have been running. What does this mean for people of faith in general? Kristen, let's start with you.
Well, my presidential candidate for 2024 is going to be John Bel Edwards. We're trying to convince him to run. I think he would be a great, faithful Democrat to run, who has a consistent life position. So we are trying to encourage him to run. As far as President Biden, being a pro-life Democrat, we've been deeply disappointed about his abortion expansion and position on abortion. So we're not too excited about him running again, simply on that issue.
JD, you get the last word.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that President Biden's position on abortion has been extremely disappointing. I think I would also say that some of his positions on immigration, and it took him a very long time, for example, to try to end Title 42, the Remain in Mexico policy that was left in place on the border for many months. There's a lot of suffering that's happening on the border, and that I feel like President Biden has paid lip service to. So I don't know. A lot of times it's going to be a choice for us as voters between two candidates that don't perfectly reflect our Catholic faith. So I think it's probably going to be another tough choice for Catholic Americans when it comes to the presidency in 4 years or in 2 years.
Well, thank you so much for the challenge and for the analysis.
Thank you.
Still ahead on EWTN News In Depth. After unprecedented protests across the communist regime, China begins to ease COVID restrictions. A look at what rules they are lifting.
At the center of my case is the right of for all to speak freely and consistent with their deeply held beliefs.
Compelled speech or discrimination. The Supreme Court case both religious groups and the LGBTQ community are watching closely.
I assist them in however they need. I am a listening ear. I eat meals with them if I'm invited to. We have resources and pass out materials like books and rosaries that we give out to crews.
Being an anchor for those living on the high seas. A look inside the work of a unique chaplaincy.
Life at sea. Crossing the vast oceans aboard a cargo ship is not easy. The hours are long, the weather conditions can be unforgiving, the work is hard. On top of that, there's no guarantee of shore leave. With varying visa rules, quick turnarounds, and stricter COVID regulations at ports, many never step on dry land for months. So how can you practice your faith? Reporter Roselle Regis spoke to a ministry that brings God on board.
Seafarers, away from families and loved ones for months on end, yearning for a home away from home. In the ports of Seattle, they are welcomed with open arms by the Seafarers Ministry. Just like their logo, an angel flying over an endless sea. This ecumenical ministry, a partnership between the Archdiocese of Seattle, the Episcopal Church, and the Lutheran Church, seeks to care for maritime workers from around the world.
Being there for them, listening to their needs, whatever it may be, whether physical or mental or spiritual.
Joey De Leon has been a deacon for the Archdiocese of Seattle for more than 10 years. He now serves as the interim executive director for the Seattle Seafarers Center. As a deacon, he's able to perform religious services, such as offering communion and other sacraments to crews.
They ask for if they can avail of communion, receiving the Holy Eucharist. So I come on board with the Holy Eucharist and provide them communion, or just being there for them, listening to their plight as a seafarer while they're at sea.
He says a favorite memory of his was when a captain requested Mass on board the ship.
He just saw how happy his crew was, which were mostly Filipinos, and he finally made a statement saying, "If I can only find my crew this happy because of the services that you provide in the Mass, then I will have Mass in all the ships that I'm in." Okay, we're ready.
The Seafarers Ministry boards ships, engages in pastoral listening, shares a meal in the galley, and sells SIM cards for their cell phones so they can connect with loved ones. It also provides transportation to shopping destinations for the seafarers who are able to go on shore leave. The Seafarers Center serves as a safe haven at port. Seafarers can use the center for recreation, rest, and prayer in the Interfaith Chapel. They also gain access to donated clothes and other goods.
About 30 to 40 ships on average come by the ports of Seattle every month. And what the Seafarers Ministry's goal is to come on board and keep the seafarers happy.
We provide a lot of awesome stuff, right? Like people can come to the center, we give them our little gifts every Christmas, we bring SIM cards and magazines for them. But the coolest part about our ministry is the fact that what we really give is like kind of the gift of like our presence.
Jack Ibsen, who started as a volunteer with a mission several years ago, says he enjoys getting to know sailors and hearing their stories. He remembers when a group of maritime workers from India were overjoyed to be in the company of fellow Catholics.
They were just saying like, hey, we're all from the same like town in India, and it's a very Catholic town, and we just don't get a lot of rosaries where we live. You know, just felt very blessed to like have someone come on board who could kind of like, meet them in that way, to share in that spiritual connection that they otherwise felt like they didn't have in other ports. So we definitely get those opportunities, and I really appreciate them.
Being a seafarer is no easy feat. According to a 2019 research by the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, seafarers are prone to anxiety, depression, emotional exhaustion, and burnout. These maritime workers who live and work on container ships, cruise ships, and bulk carriers work an average of 80 hours a week to bring the public necessary goods. And yet, they remain fairly invisible.
About 90% of all goods that we consume are brought over on container ships. People make immense personal sacrifices so that we can have our Christmases. So we like to give back and give seafarers a happy Christmas as well.
That includes gifting each seafarer with a ditty bag. With the help of the local community, the ditty bag is filled with all sorts of necessities and treats, such as knitted beanies and chocolate bars.
We give them to seafarers so that they feel appreciated and cared for, because it's very difficult to be away from your family during the holiday season. So it's just a little something to say thank you for all that you do.
Captain Subhash Anshin has spent decades of his life at sea. He says his crew was often ecstatic to see people from the Seafarers Center during their port visit.
It's always nice to see people other than the 20 people on board. You know, when you go to any port, you meet some nice people, and it always brings a cheer into them. You know, they're all very happy actually.
Serving about 20,000 seafarers that come by the ports of Seattle each year, Deacon Joey says the ultimate mission is to elevate the dignity of the seafarers, one ship at a time, with this message.
That they're loved by God, that there's always a center here in Seattle to support and assist them in whatever they need.
Rosal Regis, EWTN News in Depth.
To learn how you can donate or volunteer for the Seattle Seafarers Center, visit their website at www.mts-seattle.org.
For the first time in 2 years, Pope Francis gets to honor our Blessed Mother in a public celebration. But first, is it authoritarian, discrimination, unconstitutional? The Supreme Court case that could determine the future of free speech.
A free speech case at the Supreme Court tops our week in review. Justices heard oral argument at the start of the week for 303 Creative versus Elenis. The case involves Lori Smith, a website designer in Colorado who owns and operates 303 Creative. She wants to start creating websites for weddings, but as a Christian, does not want to promote same-sex marriage. Colorado says it's discriminatory to deny services to a protected group according to the state's public accommodations law. But Smith's lawyers say forcing her to do so violates her free speech. Smith spoke with EWTN News Nightly earlier this week.
I have always been hopeful that the court will stand to protect not only my right to create consistent with my beliefs, but everyone's right. That right is also protects the LGBT web designer who should not be forced to create custom expression in artwork opposing same-sex marriage.
Smith says her Christian faith teaches her that marriage is between a man and a woman. Her lawyers say creating a website that celebrates same-sex weddings would be an endorsement of something that conflicts with her conscience. The state of Colorado argues the case is about discrimination and that if someone sells a product in the public sphere, he or she has to sell it to, quote, all people. A constitutional scholar who served on the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court, appellate attorney Adam White, joins us now to break down this case. Adam, it's so great to have you back. I love that you come and just give us the skinny on what's really going on. The 303 Creative case is one that confuses many people because it's similar to the Colorado cake baker case. Didn't he win the right not to have to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding? Why is this different?
Well, the baker did prevail in that case and coming out of the same state under the same basic set of laws. But what was really at the heart of that case in the end was the fact that the Colorado Commission in enforcing those laws had created a really bad record in terms that commissioners were clearly biased. At least one of the commissioners was clearly biased against the baker and really intended to punish him for his religious beliefs. In this case, you don't have that same record at all. This is a much broader case about speech as a service. And so in some ways, it is a more complicated case. In other ways, it's a simpler case because it is about speech per se on a website.
And in oral argument this week, the newest justice on the bench, Ketanji Brown Jackson, brought up the issue of race. Let's listen to her comment.
So only white children and families can be customers for that particular product. Everybody else can, I'll give to everybody else, I'll sell them anything they want, just not the It's a Wonderful Life depictions. I'm expressing something, right, for your purposes, that's speech. What about, what's the other step? It's speech, and I can say anti-discrimination laws can't make me sell the It's a Wonderful Life package to non-white individuals.
This wasn't the only time references to race were made. How does the law treat race and issues of sexual identity differently?
Well, in this context, there are a lot of similarities because it arises under the Colorado anti-discrimination laws, which protect against discrimination, both in the context of race and in the context of sexual orientation. Now, I think where Justice Jackson's question was off base was in a couple of ways. First of all, nobody is saying that Ms. Smith is refusing to serve customers based on either race or sexual orientation. She's willing to provide other website services to gay people or same-sex couples just not websites for same-sex marriages. So it's really not a categorical refusal to serve somebody based on their character or on their nature. It's on the message at issue. The harder question would have been, I think, if Justice Jackson had said that if a company refused to create websites for either interracial marriages or for marriages for people of another race, because one had a fundamental opposition to people of that race or people across races getting married. That would have made it much closer to the context in this case, but nobody is suggesting that's an actual problem in Colorado. I think the case was really dominated by a lot of far-fetched hypotheticals that sometimes made the case actually more opaque and not clearer.
Another comment on the issue of public accommodations or service providers in the American marketplace was made by Justice Thomas. Let's listen to his comment.
The complicating fact here is this is not a hotel, this is not a restaurant, this is not a riverboat or a train. I'm interested in the intersection of public accommodations law and speech.
How did the justices try to balance a website designer's role versus housing or access to water and power?
This was a crucial line of questioning throughout the day. Public accommodations law tends to involve the classic sorts of services that Justice Thomas alludes to there. Hotels, restaurants, famously lunch counters in the civil rights era, where people were refusing in truly awful ways to serve customers at all, to give a meal to a Black person in a public setting. You can't do that. The anti-discrimination laws have long prohibited that, and for good reason. But Justice Thomas pressed the litigants, especially Colorado, to give examples of where anti-discrimination laws had been applied and approved by the courts for services that are much more tailored and specifically involving speech. And I didn't hear any answers from the litigants, and I don't think Justice Thomas did either. My guess is that remains a big question for him.
So what do you think will happen in this case?
There's two steps to the case. First, the court has to decide whether it can decide the case at all. There's questions about whether the dispute is really, as we say, ripe as a constitutional matter, since Colorado has not actively enforced this against Ms. Smith and her company. That's not an easy answer. There often are pre-enforcement challenges that are allowed, but it's a very fact-sensitive question, and I'm curious to see how the justices ultimately grapple with it. If they do decide they can hear the basic constitutional issue, I think the justices are lined up to affirm Ms. Smith's free speech rights here, but my guess is whatever they decide is going to be a very fact-sensitive decision, just as the Masterpiece Cake Shop was, and it'll lead the door to future litigation in Colorado and in other states.
So you don't think this will be a sweeping decision?
It's possible, but I think it's going to require a lot of work from the justices and answering a lot of questions that the litigants didn't.
Well, we'll be watching this very carefully, and we hope that you'll come back and join us once they do decide next summer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam. In another case about rights of conscience, a federal appeals court has protected Catholic healthcare providers from the federal transgender mandate. The 2016 mandate required doctors, religious hospitals, and virtually all private insurance companies to perform and cover gender transition procedures on any patient, including children, even if the doctor believed the procedure to be harmful. The Sisters of Mercy and a coalition of Catholic healthcare providers sued to protect their religious freedom. The Biden administration has until March to appeal. Russia suffered multiple attacks on their military infrastructure this week. Drones hit 2 air bases on Monday and an airfield on Tuesday. The two sites are hundreds of miles inside Russian territory, and Ukraine is not claiming responsibility for the attacks. The U.S. State Department responded to questions on the attacks earlier this week.
We have not provided Ukraine with weapons that it is to use inside of Russia. We've been very clear that these are defensive supplies. The president said very clearly some time ago, we are not enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders. We are not encouraging Ukraine to strike beyond its borders.
Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the eastern Donetsk region and northeastern Kharkiv region have come under heavy Russian fire. The war will reach its 10th month mark on Christmas Eve. EWTN News In Depth's Colin Flynn is currently in Ukraine and is gathering a special to update us on the situation there and how Christians are preparing for Christmas amid the war. Tune in next week for that story. Despite multiple reports of attacks against Christians in Nigeria, the Department of State excluded the country from its annual watch list of countries with egregious religious freedom violations. More than 4,000 Christians have been murdered by Islamic jihadist groups, and more than 2,000 have been abducted, including Catholic priests and nuns, according to the International Society for Civil Liberties and Rule of Law. We brought you coverage of the massacre at a Catholic church earlier this year, where at least 40 people were killed. While the State Department has designated Islamic terror groups in Nigeria as entities of particular concern, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, says the Nigerian government needs to be held accountable.
It seems that they believe that the non-state actors are really the primary perpetrators of religious violence and religious suppression in Nigeria. This is where the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom parts with the State Department. We believe the government of Nigeria is complicit, both intentionally and sometimes turning a blind eye to the violations of religious freedom, serious and severe violations of religious freedom in the country of Nigeria.
USCIRF works closely with the State Department to undergo in-country research and make suggestions for their watch list. This is the second year in a row that USCIRF's recommendations on Nigeria were ignored. China is easing some of their stringent COVID restrictions. Citizens will no longer have to show a negative virus test for domestic travel or to enter places including schools, clinics, and retirement homes. They will also no longer have to provide a health code that proved a negative test result was current to enter public venues. And COVID patients with mild symptoms can quarantine at home instead of at a government facility. New guidelines limiting lockdowns to only high-risk areas were also issued. The moves come in the wake of massive demonstrations that sparked across the nation, some of them violent, in protest of strict COVID lockdowns, as well as voicing broader grievances against the Communist Party's authoritarian rule. The United States is now dealing with what is being called the worst flu outbreak in more than a decade. So far, more than 8 million people have caught the flu, and hospitals saw the most patients for the flu over the Thanksgiving holiday since 2010. Health officials believe COVID precautions like masks protected people from the flu, but left immune systems vulnerable to seasonal respiratory infections. The CDC encourages all adults and children 6 months and older to get the flu vaccine ahead of the Christmas season. And 'tis the season. The traditional Vatican Christmas tree was lit last weekend in St. Peter's Square. The nearly 100-foot white fir came from a mountain village in central Italy. Its decorations were made by young people from a psychiatric rehab facility and residents of a nursing home. The tree was unveiled along with a life-sized hand-carved nativity made by woodworkers in northern Italy. The Christmas tree and creche will be on display through early January. A time-honored tradition of the Holy Father returns to Rome. That's up after the break.
Up next, we visit the workbench of artists who carve world-famous nativity scenes by hand.
The Advent season is a season of hope as we wait for the coming of our Lord into the world as our King and Savior. A time-honored tradition of expressing that joy is a creche. EWTN Rome correspondent Colin Flynn traveled to Udine, Italy to meet woodworkers who lovingly create nativity scenes by hand. Take a look.
This Christmas, the Vatican is displaying a traditional wood-carved nativity scene and beautifully decorated Christmas tree in St. Peter's Square. The crib's design is inspired by the dome of St. Peter's Basilica behind it. And 700 kilometers away in the mountains of northern Italy, this is where the crib was designed and built. The small town of Sutrio has a long history of nativity scenes.
Every home, even when I was a child, made a nativity scene. People say, let's go to Sutrio to see the Tenno crib. So it's like a symbol of the village.
The Tenno crib on display here in this local museum is how it all began. And today, locals continue that tradition, creating beautiful cribs and elaborate nativity scenes for the public to enjoy.
Sutrio is a very beautiful town. It lends itself very well to these things. It has ancient villages that are set up with nativity scenes, and so the entire population has also been encouraged to create their own work. I made this nativity scene a few years ago because there is a long tradition of creating nativity scenes here, and I wanted to make something of my own, something that represented me personally and the traditions of the village. I made the figurines in my own way, very simply, using poor materials. You can see this one here. I put wood and iron in it. And then I dressed it. It's very simple. I didn't spend anything. I only used what I had at home.
The design of this year's crib in St. Peter's Square pays homage to the long history of wood carving in Sutrio and is made up of 18 life-size statues, hand-carved by 11 artists.
The history of wood has always been important for Sutrio. The furniture industry or craftsman was the heart of the town. I too was a furniture maker. Then I retired and devoted myself to showing the village to tourists.
No trees were cut down for the cedar wood statues or for the structure. The figure of baby Jesus is made with recycled materials, and the cradle in which he lays was carved from a tree that was uprooted during a storm. It's believed that the tradition of creating a crib was started by St. Francis of Assisi as a way to demonstrate to people what happened on the night Jesus was born 2,000 years ago. And now it is Pope Francis who is the recipient of a beautiful crib that is on display in St. Peter's Square at the Vatican in Rome that has come from this very town in the north of Italy, where they continue the tradition of creating beautiful reminders of the Nativity. In Sutrio, Colm Flynn, EWTN News In Depth.
This week, Pope Francis celebrated our Blessed Mother on the Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception with flowers and prayer at a statue in Rome that sits on the top of a 40-foot pillar. The Catholic Church recognizes the Holy Conception of our Blessed Mother as a pure vessel for God to dwell, a tradition that dates back to 1953 with Pope Pius XII. This is the first time the Holy Father has done so in a public audience since the start of the pandemic. The Pontiff invited the faithful to entrust themselves to Our Lady. That does it for this week's episode of EWTN News In Depth. Be sure to join us next week for more stories important to your Catholic life. See you then.